The snow fell in thick, suffocating curtains across the Belgian countryside on that bitter December morning in 1944. The forest of Bastogne, normally a place of quiet beauty, had transformed into a killing ground where the frost-covered earth trembled beneath the advancing weight of German armor. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison crouched in a frozen foxhole, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he peered through his binoculars at a sight that would have sent most commanders into retreat. 23 Panzer tanks, their dark hulls cutting through the morning mist like predators closing in on wounded prey. Morrison's hands, steady despite the cold and the impossible odds, lowered the binoculars slowly. Around him, his men, ordinary American infantrymen, most of whom had been civilians just months before, waited for orders. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. The conventional military wisdom of the day dictated only one logical response: withdraw, regroup, call in air support or heavy armor to counter the German behemoths bearing down on their position. But Edward Morrison had never been one to follow conventional military wisdom. The 32-year-old officer from Massachusetts had spent the last 18 months developing something the Pentagon brass had called a crazy idea, a revolutionary approach to tank warfare that turned every established doctrine on its head. While generals in Washington debated tank specifications and armor thickness, Morrison had been teaching farm boys and factory workers to think like predators, to see the massive German war machines not as invincible fortresses of steel, but as vulnerable targets with exploitable weaknesses. Now, in this frozen Belgian forest with enemy armor closing from 3 directions, his theory would face its ultimate test. The thunder of Panzer engines grew louder, closer. Morrison could see the commander of the lead tank, a German officer standing in his turret with the confidence of a man who believed himself invincible. That confidence, Morrison knew, would be the man's undoing. He raised his hand, giving the signal his men had drilled thousands of times in training, a training regimen so unorthodox it had nearly gotten Morrison court-martialed 3 times. The infantrymen around him melted into the landscape, disappearing into positions that conventional tactical manuals said were suicidal for engaging armor. What happened in the next 63 minutes would rewrite the book on infantry anti-tank warfare. By the time the gun smoke cleared and the fires from burning panzers illuminated the winter sky, Morrison's unit would have destroyed 17 of the 23 tanks without losing a single man. It was an outcome that should have been impossible, a David versus Goliath story written in steel and fire across the snows of Bastogne. Yet it was merely the opening act of a larger drama, one that would see Morrison's revolutionary tactics account for the destruction of 147 German Panzer tanks over the course of 63 days, fundamentally challenging everything the military establishment thought it knew about armored warfare. But this story begins not in the frozen fields of Belgium, but in the classrooms and laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where a young engineering student with an unusual fascination for mechanics and psychology first began to see warfare as a problem of innovation rather than tradition. If you have found this story compelling so far, please consider subscribing to our channel and enabling notifications. We bring you deeply researched historical documentaries like this one every week, uncovering the forgotten stories that shaped our world. The path that would lead Edward Morrison to that frozen foxhole in Bastogne began on a crisp autumn day in 1934, when he first walked through the gates of MIT as a wide-eyed freshman from Worcester, Massachusetts. The son of a mechanical engineer and a schoolteacher, Morrison had grown up in a household where dinner-table conversations revolved around problem-solving and critical thinking. His father, a veteran of the First World War who had served as a logistics officer, had instilled in young Edward a respect for military service tempered with a healthy skepticism of military bureaucracy. At MIT, Morrison distinguished himself not through social connections or athletic prowess, but through an unusual ability to see connections between seemingly unrelated fields. While his classmates focused narrowly on their chosen disciplines, Morrison audited courses in psychology, philosophy, and even fine arts alongside his required engineering curriculum. His senior thesis, titled Mechanical Systems and Human Psychology, An Integrated Approach to Industrial Design, raised eyebrows among the faculty for its unconventional premise that effective engineering required understanding not just how machines worked, but how humans interacted with and perceived those machines. One professor, Dr. Harold Chen, would later recall Morrison as the most intellectually curious student I encountered in 30 years of teaching, and also the most frustrating, because he refused to accept any principle or doctrine without questioning its fundamental assumptions. This tendency to question everything would become Morrison's defining characteristic, one that would serve him brilliantly in combat, but would also make him a perpetual thorn in the side of military authority. Morrison graduated in June 1938 with highest honors, at a time when the world teetered on the brink of global conflict. While many of his classmates rushed to secure lucrative positions with major corporations, Morrison accepted a modest role with a small firm in Boston that specialized in industrial problem-solving. He spent his days consulting with factories on production efficiency, analyzing workflows and identifying bottlenecks, work that might have seemed mundane but was teaching him invaluable lessons about systems thinking and human behavior under pressure. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Morrison followed the military developments with intense interest. He began collecting technical specifications on German armor, studying photographs and intelligence reports with the same meticulous attention he had once devoted to analyzing factory production lines. His apartment gradually transformed into an informal research center, its walls covered with diagrams, calculations, and notes that attempted to understand not just how tanks functioned, but how they were used in combined arms operations. His friends and colleagues thought his obsession strange, perhaps even morbid. America was not yet at war, and many harbored hopes that the conflict might remain a European affair. But Morrison sensed something his peers did not, that the industrial might of America would inevitably be drawn into the conflict, and that when it happened, the nation would need more than just manufacturing capacity. It would need innovative thinking to counter an enemy that had spent years perfecting the art of mechanized warfare. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed Morrison's theoretical interest in military affairs into urgent personal conviction. Within days, he had walked into an Army recruiting office in downtown Boston, expecting to be assigned to an engineering unit where his technical expertise could be utilized. What he did not expect was the interview that followed with a captain from Army intelligence who had been quietly reviewing the applications of technically trained recruits. The captain, whose name has been lost to history but whose impact was profound, had noticed something unusual in Morrison's application. Where most candidates listed conventional qualifications and work experience, Morrison had included a detailed technical analysis of German tank tactics in France, complete with diagrams and proposed countermeasures. The captain spent 3 hours questioning Morrison about his ideas, his analytical methods, and his unconventional educational background. 3 weeks later, Morrison received orders that surprised him. He was to report to Fort Benning, Georgia, not to an engineering unit, but to officer candidate school. Someone in the War Department had evidently concluded that Morrison's talents were better suited to leadership than to technical support. He arrived at Fort Benning in February 1942, one of 200 candidates selected for intensive training in infantry tactics and leadership. The 12 weeks of OCS proved revelatory for Morrison, though not in the way the Army intended. While he excelled in the tactical exercises and leadership evaluations, he found himself increasingly frustrated with the Army's approach to anti-tank warfare. The standard doctrine of the period treated tanks as something to be countered by other tanks or by dedicated anti-tank guns towed by trucks, specialized equipment that required extensive training and coordination. Infantry were taught to avoid tanks when possible, and if confrontation was unavoidable, to call for support from heavier weapons. To Morrison's analytical mind, trained to identify inefficiencies and bottlenecks in complex systems, this doctrine represented a catastrophic failure of imagination. It created a psychological dynamic where ordinary soldiers viewed tanks as invincible, something beyond their ability to engage. It also created practical vulnerabilities. What happened when air support was unavailable, when anti-tank guns could not be brought forward, when infantry found themselves facing armor with nothing but their standard weapons and whatever ingenuity they could muster? During one training exercise, Morrison's platoon was assigned to defend a position against a simulated tank attack. The exercise parameters assumed the defenders would hold their ground, take casualties from the attacking armor, and eventually be rescued by friendly tanks arriving from the rear. Morrison, to the astonishment of his instructors, ordered his men to abandon their prepared defensive positions, and instead scattered them in a loose perimeter around the expected axis of attack. When the enemy tanks, actually trucks modified to look like tanks, advanced into the position, Morrison's soldiers converged from multiple angles, destroying 3 of the 4 vehicles before the exercise was called off. The training officer who had designed the exercise was furious, accusing Morrison of violating the parameters and failing to follow standard defensive doctrine. But the colonel overseeing the OCS program was intrigued. He invited Morrison to his office that evening and asked a simple question. "Lieutenant, do you actually think infantry can fight tanks effectively, or was that just a training exercise trick?" Morrison's answer would change the trajectory of his military career. He spent the next 2 hours presenting an impromptu lecture on armor vulnerabilities, crew psychology, and the potential for well-trained infantry to disrupt and destroy armored formations through unconventional tactics. He spoke about the psychological tendency of tank crews to feel invincible in their steel cocoons and how that false confidence could be exploited. He discussed the mechanical limitations of tanks, their restricted vision, their dependence on infantry support, their vulnerability to attacks from unexpected angles. Most importantly, he outlined a training philosophy that would transform how soldiers thought about engaging armor. The colonel listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Morrison finished, expecting dismissal or perhaps disciplinary action for his presumption, the colonel asked another question. "If I gave you a company of men and 3 months to train them, could you prove this theory?" Morrison paused, understanding that this was the kind of moment that defined careers and lives. The conservative answer, the safe answer, would be to hedge, to ask for more time, more resources, more support. But Morrison was not a conservative thinker, and he understood that opportunities like this rarely came twice. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "Give me the men and the time, and I will show you what properly trained infantry can do against armor." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You will graduate OCS in 2 weeks as a second lieutenant. Your first assignment will be to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where you will have access to actual tanks for training purposes. I am giving you exactly what you asked for, a company of men and 3 months. But understand this, Lieutenant Morrison, if you fail, if your theories prove to be just academic speculation that gets soldiers killed, your military career will be over before it really begins. The Army cannot afford to waste resources on experiments that do not produce results." Morrison graduated OCS in April 1942 and arrived at Fort Knox in early May, carrying with him a footlocker full of notes, diagrams, and calculations. He had been assigned a company of 180 men, most of them recent recruits with minimal military training. They were young, averaging just 22 years of age, and they came from every corner of American life: factory workers from Detroit, farmers from Iowa, shop clerks from New York, students whose college educations had been interrupted by the draft. What they shared was a complete lack of experience with armored warfare. The conventional approach to training these men would have been to follow the established curriculum: basic infantry tactics, weapons familiarization, physical conditioning, and drill. Morrison threw that manual out the window on his first day. Instead, he gathered his new company in an empty hangar and asked them a question: "Who here has hunted deer or other large game?" About 30 hands went up, the men exchanging confused glances. Morrison smiled. "Good. You men are going to be my instructors. Everyone else, you are going to learn the basic principles of hunting, not because we are going into the forest to hunt animals, but because we are going to hunt something much bigger, much more dangerous, and much more important. We are going to learn to hunt tanks." The confusion in the hangar was palpable. These young soldiers had enlisted or been drafted to fight for their country, expecting to learn how to shoot rifles and dig foxholes, not to receive lectures on hunting techniques. But Morrison was just getting started. Over the next 3 months, he would systematically dismantle every assumption his men held about warfare, about tanks, and about their own capabilities. The first week of training involved no weapons at all. Instead, Morrison took his entire company to a nearby tank training ground where American crews were practicing maneuvers. He ordered his men to simply watch, not the tanks themselves, but how the crews operated them. Where did the commanders look? When did they button up their hatches? How did they communicate with each other? What did they do when they lost sight of supporting infantry? The soldiers took notes, made sketches, and began to understand that a tank was not a single invincible entity, but a complex system operated by human beings with human limitations. In the second week, Morrison introduced what he called the anatomy lesson. He acquired a damaged Sherman tank that had been relegated to the scrap heap and spent 3 days showing his men every mechanical vulnerability the vehicle possessed. They crawled underneath it to see the thin belly armor. They examined the engine compartment to understand how the power plant worked and where it was vulnerable to damage. They studied the vision ports and periscopes that tank crews depended on, understanding how limited a tanker's visibility truly was. Most importantly, Morrison had them climb inside the tank, experiencing firsthand the claustrophobic, disorienting environment in which tank crews operated. "A tank is not a fortress," Morrison told them repeatedly. "It is a mechanical system with specific vulnerabilities, operated by men who cannot see everything, who are isolated from the world by steel walls, who become psychologically dependent on that steel for their sense of security. Your job is to understand that system so thoroughly that you can exploit its weaknesses." The third week introduced weapons training, but again Morrison's approach defied convention. Rather than simply teaching marksmanship with the standard infantry weapons, he focused on understanding what each weapon could actually do against armor. The company's bazookas, officially designated as M1 rocket launchers, became objects of intensive study. Morrison had his men disassemble them, understand their mechanics, calculate their effective ranges, and practice firing them from every conceivable position and angle. But he also taught them something the manual did not cover: the psychology of using these weapons effectively. The Bazooka manual will tell you to fire from a prone position at a range of 100 to 150 yards, Morrison explained. That is fine for a training range where the target is stationary and cooperative. In actual combat, that distance is not close enough. You need to be near enough to guarantee a hit on your first shot, because you may not get a second one. That means 50 yards or less. It means waiting until the tank is so close that you can see the rivets on its hull before you fire. This concept, waiting until enemy armor was dangerously close before engaging, went against every instinct of self-preservation. The men initially resisted the idea, arguing that it exposed them to unnecessary risk. Morrison's response was to show them the mathematics. At 150 yards, even a skilled soldier with a bazooka had perhaps a 40% chance of hitting a moving tank. At 50 yards, that probability increased to 90%. More importantly, at 50 yards, the rocket had maximum penetrating power against armor. "You must make a choice," Morrison told them bluntly. "You can engage from a safe distance and probably miss, which means the tank will certainly find and kill you, or you can engage from a distance that feels terrifyingly close, guarantee the kill with your first shot, and survive the encounter. Fear is natural. Letting that fear make your tactical decisions is suicide." The fourth and fifth weeks focused on what Morrison called three-dimensional thinking. He taught his men to see the battlefield not as a flat surface but as a space with vertical dimension, cover, concealment, and multiple vectors of attack. They practiced moving through terrain while remaining hidden from tank crews' limited sight lines. They learned to use buildings, trees, depressions in the ground, even shadows to mask their movements. They drilled on approaching tanks from behind, from the sides, from elevated positions, anywhere except the heavily armored front where the tank's main gun could be brought to bear. Morrison also introduced an element that shocked many of his men: the deliberate use of sacrificial decoys. He taught them that in tank infantry combat, the side that controlled the enemy's attention controlled the outcome. Small teams would deliberately reveal themselves to draw the tank's attention in one direction while the actual attack team approached from another angle. It was a tactic that required trust, coordination, and nerves of steel, but Morrison drilled it relentlessly until his men could execute it in their sleep. By the sixth week, the men of Morrison's company were no longer thinking like infantry. They were thinking like hunters, like problem solvers, like engineers seeking to exploit vulnerabilities in a complex system. Morrison organized them into specialized teams: spotters who would identify tanks and track their movements, attack teams who would execute the kills, support teams who would provide covering fire and create diversions. Each man understood not just his own role, but how his role fit into the larger tactical picture. The 7th through 10th weeks involved realistic combat simulations. Morrison had convinced the Fort Knox Tank School to allow his infantry company to practice against actual tank crews during their training exercises. The tanks were armed only with cameras and smoke generators to simulate their main guns, while Morrison's men carried training versions of bazookas that fired marking charges instead of live rockets. The exercise rules were simple. If a tank killed an infantryman by photographing him in the open or marking him with smoke, that soldier was out of the exercise. If Morrison's men successfully destroyed a tank by scoring a marking hit in a critical area, that tank was out. The first few exercises were disasters. Morrison's men, despite their training, found that executing tactics under pressure against real tanks was vastly different from practicing against stationary targets. They moved too slowly, attacked from predictable directions, failed to coordinate their decoy and attack teams effectively. The tank crews, despite using training restrictions, decimated the infantry in the early exercises. Morrison accepted these failures as learning opportunities, conducting intensive after-action reviews where every mistake was analyzed and every lesson extracted. But by the 4th exercise, something began to change. Morrison's men started to anticipate tank movements, to exploit the limited visibility of the buttoned-up crews, to coordinate their attacks with ruthless efficiency. In one memorable exercise, a single squad of Morrison's soldiers managed to destroy 3 tanks in rapid succession by using a combination of decoy tactics and close-range attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The tank commanders were stunned and more than a little angry at being bested by infantry. The 11th week brought Morrison's most controversial innovation, psychological conditioning. He had observed that many soldiers, when faced with the sight and sound of an approaching tank, experienced a form of paralysis rooted in primal fear. The ground-shaking vibration, the mechanical roar of the engine, the sheer overwhelming size of the vehicle, all of these combined to trigger a fight-or-flight response that undermined rational tactical thinking. Morrison's solution was systematic desensitization. He arranged for tanks to drive directly at his men while they remained in their positions, holding their ground even as dozens of tons of steel bore down on them, stopping just feet away. He had his soldiers practice lying in shallow depressions while tanks drove over them, the vehicle's treads passing just inches from their bodies. He subjected them to the sounds of tank engines and weapons fire for hours at a time, until the noise became just background rather than a psychological threat. Many of the men hated this training. Some requested transfers, calling Morrison's methods cruel or even sadistic. The base psychologist expressed concerns about the potential psychological damage of such training, but Morrison was unmoved. In actual combat, he argued, these men will face tanks that are trying to kill them. If they panic, if they freeze, if they let fear override their training, they will die. Better they learn to master that fear here, in a controlled environment, than discover in battle that they cannot function under pressure. The final 2 weeks were spent integrating all the elements, tactics, weapons proficiency, psychological conditioning, team coordination, into comprehensive battle drills. Morrison created scenarios that were intentionally difficult, often impossible, designed to force his men to think creatively under pressure. In one exercise, he placed a squad in a position where they were attacked by tanks from 3 directions simultaneously, forcing them to prioritize targets, coordinate their limited bazooka ammunition, and use terrain to their advantage. As the 3-month training period drew to a close, Morrison arranged for a final demonstration, one that would either vindicate his methods or end his military career. He invited senior officers from Fort Knox, including the post commander, to observe a large-scale exercise pitting his infantry company against an entire platoon of tanks, 5 Shermans operating with standard tactical doctrine and supported by a company of infantry. The exercise took place on a warm August morning in 1942, across a training ground that included open terrain, wooded areas, and a small village of training buildings. The tank platoon's objective was to advance across the battlefield and seize the village. Morrison's company was tasked with stopping them using only their standard infantry weapons, including bazookas. The tank commanders approached the exercise with confidence bordering on arrogance. They had spent months training in armored tactics, and had participated in dozens of exercises against infantry. They expected to suppress Morrison's men with machine gun fire, overrun their positions, and secure the objective in under an hour. What they encountered instead was a revelation that challenged everything they thought they knew about infantry armor combat. Morrison's men were invisible. As the tanks advanced, supported by their infantry, they saw nothing but empty terrain. The supporting infantry, following standard doctrine, moved ahead of the tanks to scout for anti-tank weapons. They found nothing. The tank commanders, growing confident, ordered their vehicles forward at increased speed, eager to complete the exercise and prove the superiority of armor over infantry. The first tank died without ever seeing its killer. A carefully concealed team, positioned in a shallow depression barely 30 yards from the tank's path, waited until the vehicle's flank was exposed and fired a marking rocket directly into the engine compartment. The tank's smoke generator activated, indicating a mobility kill. Before the crew could report what had happened, 2 more tanks took hits from different directions, one from a team that had scaled a building and fired down onto the thin top armor, another from soldiers who had allowed the tank to pass their position before emerging and firing at the vulnerable rear. The remaining 2 tanks, now aware they were under attack, but unable to see their attackers, attempted to suppress Morrison's positions with machine gun fire. But Morrison's men had already moved, fading back into cover and repositioning for new attack angles. The supporting infantry, caught in the open and confused about where the fire was coming from, took heavy casualties from Morrison's riflemen, who had been positioned specifically to exploit this moment of confusion. Within 20 minutes of initial contact, all 5 tanks had been destroyed. The supporting infantry had suffered severe casualties, and Morrison's company had accomplished its mission with minimal losses. The observing officers stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. This was not supposed to be possible. Infantry, especially infantry without heavy anti-tank guns or armor support, were not supposed to defeat tanks in open combat. The post commander, a career armor officer who had fought in World War I and had devoted his professional life to the study of mechanized warfare, approached Morrison after the exercise. The young lieutenant, promoted to first lieutenant just 2 weeks earlier, stood at attention, uncertain whether he was about to be commended or court-martialed for embarrassing the tank school. "Lieutenant Morrison," the colonel said slowly, "in 30 years of military service, I have never seen infantry perform like that against armor. What you have demonstrated here contradicts every tactical manual we have. The question is, can you replicate this with other units, or is this a unique result possible only with this specific group of men?" Morrison had anticipated this question. "Sir, these men were randomly assigned to me 12 weeks ago. They possessed no special skills, no prior military experience of significance. What they have now is not innate ability, but trained capability. The tactics and techniques can be taught to any unit given sufficient time and proper instruction." The colonel nodded thoughtfully. "I am recommending to the War Department that your methods be evaluated for broader implementation. I am also recommending your immediate promotion to captain and your assignment to develop a formal training program. The Army is going to need officers who can think beyond the manual." Lieutenant Morrison: "Germany has had years to perfect their armor tactics. We are still learning. What you have shown us today is that we may have been learning the wrong lessons." Morrison's success at Fort Knox might have led to rapid dissemination of his tactics throughout the Army, but instead it triggered something he had not anticipated. The Army in 1942 was an institution in transition, rapidly expanding from a peacetime force of just over 200,000 men to a wartime colossus that would eventually exceed 8 million. In such an environment, standardization was paramount. Training manuals, doctrine and procedures were being codified and distributed as quickly as they could be printed. The last thing the Army needed, from the perspective of many senior officers, was a maverick lieutenant proposing radically different approaches that would require rewriting those carefully prepared manuals. Morrison's promotion to captain came through in September 1942, but instead of being assigned to develop a formal training program as the Fort Knox commander had recommended, he found himself transferred to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with vague orders to continue development of infantry anti-tank tactics. He was given an office, a secretary, and access to a small training area, but no authority to implement his program on a larger scale, and no clear path to getting his methods adopted by the broader army. For the next 6 months, Morrison existed in a bureaucratic limbo. He wrote training manuals that were reviewed and shelved. He prepared detailed reports on his Fort Knox exercises that were filed away without action. He requested opportunities to train additional units, and was told that resources were not available. Meanwhile, American forces were fighting in North Africa, encountering German armor in combat for the first time, and suffering losses that might have been reduced had Morrison's tactics been more widely disseminated. The frustration of this period was compounded by reports from the battlefield that confirmed Morrison's theories. After-action reports from North Africa described American infantry's difficulty in engaging German tanks, their tendency to panic when confronted with armor, their reliance on unavailable support assets. Morrison read these reports with growing desperation, knowing that soldiers were dying for lack of training that he could provide if only the army would allow him to do so. His breakthrough came not through official channels but through personal connection. In March 1943, Morrison attended a conference at the Army War College, where officers from various branches discussed lessons learned from the North African campaign. During a presentation on armor tactics, Morrison raised his hand during the question period and politely but firmly challenged the presenter's assumptions about infantry vulnerability to tanks. His comments caught the attention of a brigadier general named Thomas Warren, who pulled Morrison aside during a break. Warren, a veteran of World War I who had commanded infantry units in France, had been troubled by the same reports Morrison had seen. He questioned Morrison extensively about his Fort Knox experience and his training methods. Impressed by what he heard, Warren made a decision that would finally give Morrison the opportunity he needed. He arranged for Morrison to be transferred to his division, the newly formed 106th Infantry Division, with orders to implement his anti-tank training program across the entire division. Morrison arrived at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, in April 1943 to take command of the division's anti-tank training section. He had been promoted to major and given responsibility for training 15,000 men in his revolutionary tactics. It was everything he had sought: authority, resources, and a command willing to embrace innovative thinking. But it also meant that his theories would face the most rigorous test yet. Could his methods work not with a single hand-picked company, but with an entire division of soldiers at various skill levels? The challenge was immense. Where he had previously spent 3 months training 180 men, he now had to train 15,000 men in a fraction of that time. The division was scheduled to ship overseas in early 1944, giving Morrison roughly 8 months to transform ordinary infantrymen into tank hunters. He needed to scale his training program, create standardized instruction methods that other officers could teach, and prove that his tactics worked beyond the controlled environment of Fort Knox. Morrison's approach was to train trainers. He selected 100 officers and non-commissioned officers from across the division and spent 6 intensive weeks teaching them not just his tactics but his philosophy. He emphasized that anti-tank training was not about memorizing procedures but about understanding principles: how armor functioned, how tank crews thought, how infantry could exploit vulnerabilities. These 100 trainers then returned to their respective units to implement the program throughout the division. The training was not universally popular. Many soldiers, particularly those with prior military experience, resisted tactics that contradicted their existing training. Some officers, particularly those from armor backgrounds, viewed Morrison's emphasis on close-range engagement as reckless. There were complaints to division headquarters, requests for clarification of doctrine, and in some cases outright refusal to implement the training. General Warren, to his credit, backed Morrison completely. When a battalion commander complained that the close-range tactics were too dangerous and requested permission to revert to standard doctrine, Warren personally visited the battalion and observed a training exercise. Afterward, he gathered the battalion's officers and delivered a blunt message: "Gentlemen, in a few months you will be in Europe facing the best tank crews Germany has to offer. You can follow Major Morrison's tactics, which give you a fighting chance to destroy those tanks and survive, or you can follow standard doctrine, call for support that may not be available, and watch your men die. The choice is yours, but if you choose standard doctrine and your battalion takes unnecessary casualties as a result, you will answer to me personally." The complaints stopped. Morrison's training became the division standard. By December 1943, the 106th Infantry Division had completed the most comprehensive anti-tank training program any American division had received. Morrison had also continued to refine his tactics based on reports from Italy, where American forces were now engaged in heavy fighting against German armor. He incorporated lessons about terrain utilization, coordination with supporting arms, and adaptation of tactics to different types of German tanks. The final validation of his training program came in January 1944, when the division conducted a massive field exercise against an armor brigade borrowed from the 2nd Armored Division. Over a period of 5 days, Morrison's infantry repeatedly engaged and defeated armored formations using his tactics. The tank crews, veterans who had trained for months in armored warfare, were consistently outmaneuvered by infantry they had expected to easily suppress. The exercise umpires, initially skeptical of Morrison's methods, certified that the 106th Infantry Division had demonstrated extraordinary proficiency in anti-tank operations far exceeding standard training objectives. Morrison had proven his concept beyond any reasonable doubt. His tactics worked, they could be taught at scale, and they gave infantry a realistic capability to engage and defeat armor without requiring specialized equipment or extensive support. The question now was whether these tactics, developed on American training grounds against American tanks, would prove equally effective against German Panzers operated by battle-hardened crews in the chaotic reality of European combat. That question would be answered beginning in October 1944, when the 106th Infantry Division crossed the Atlantic and entered the European theater of operations. Morrison, promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned as the division's operations officer with specific responsibility for anti-tank operations, was about to see his theories tested in the crucible of actual warfare. The stakes could not have been higher. If his tactics worked, they would save countless American lives and provide a crucial advantage against German armor. If they failed, the reputation he had built would be destroyed, and more importantly, soldiers who had trusted his training would pay with their lives. The division entered the line in early December 1944, assigned to a quiet sector in the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. It was considered a good area for a new division to gain combat experience. The German forces in the sector were thought to be weak, and major offensive operations were not expected. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were conserved strength for defensive operations along the Rhine, not preparing for attacks in the Ardennes. The 106th Infantry Division settled into defensive positions, conducted patrols, and began the routine of front-line duty. Morrison spent these initial weeks visiting front-line units, observing how his training translated to actual combat conditions, and making minor adjustments to tactics based on the reality of the European terrain. The Belgian countryside, with its dense forests and narrow roads, was very different from the training grounds of Indiana. Morrison refined his guidance on ambush positions, approach routes, and coordination signals to account for the limited visibility and challenging terrain. On December 15, 1944, intelligence reports began arriving that suggested unusual German activity across the front. Radio intercepts indicated movement of major units, and reconnaissance patrols reported sounds of heavy vehicles moving under cover of darkness. Morrison, his mind trained to analyze patterns and anticipate enemy actions, felt a growing sense of unease. The Germans were moving something large into position, something that required secrecy and extensive preparation. Every instinct told him that the quiet sector was about to become very loud indeed. He drafted a warning to division headquarters, recommending that frontline units be placed on high alert, and that anti-tank teams be positioned at key road junctions and likely avenues of approach. His warning was noted but not acted upon. Higher headquarters remained convinced that German forces in the sector were incapable of major offensive operations. Morrison could only ensure that his own units were as prepared as possible and wait to see if his instincts were correct. He would not have to wait long. In the early morning hours of December 16, 1944, the German army launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the massive offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Along a 50-mile front in the Ardennes, 3 German armies totaling over 400,000 men and nearly 1,500 tanks and assault guns crashed into American lines. The 106th Infantry Division, holding one of the key sectors, took the full weight of the German onslaught. Morrison was at division headquarters when the first reports came in, confusing, fragmentary, terrifying reports of massive artillery barrages, tank formations emerging from the morning fog, infantry positions being overrun. Within hours, communications with two of the division's 3 regiments were cut off, and it became clear that the division was facing a catastrophic situation. The Germans had achieved complete surprise, attacking with overwhelming force at precisely the point where the American line was weakest. As dawn broke on that December morning, Morrison made a decision that would define not only his career but his life. Rather than remain at headquarters trying to coordinate a defense that was rapidly collapsing, he grabbed his combat gear, assembled a small team of soldiers, and headed toward the sound of the guns. If his tactics were going to be tested, if his theories were going to prove their worth, it would not be from the safety of a command post, but in the frozen forests where American soldiers were fighting for their lives against the finest armored formations Germany could field. The scene that greeted Morrison as he reached the frontline positions was one of controlled chaos. American infantry, many of whom had never experienced combat until that morning, were falling back before the advancing German armor and infantry. The roads were clogged with vehicles trying to retreat, and the forests echoed with the sound of tank engines, artillery explosions, and small arms fire. Officers were trying to organize defensive positions, but the speed and weight of the German advance was overwhelming conventional attempts at defense. Morrison commandeered a jeep and began racing along the crumbling American line, looking for units that were still intact and in positions where his anti-tank tactics could be employed. He found what he was looking for at a small crossroads near the village of Schönberg, where a company of American infantry had taken up hasty defensive positions in the surrounding forest. The company commander, a captain named Robert Hayes, was preparing to withdraw. German tanks had been reported advancing along the main road, and Hayes had no anti-tank guns or armor support to counter them. Morrison identified himself and quickly assessed the situation. The terrain was nearly ideal for his tactics. Dense forest on both sides of a narrow road, with good cover and multiple potential firing positions. The company had 4 bazooka teams and sufficient ammunition. Most importantly, Hayes's company had gone through Morrison's training program back at Camp Atterbury. The men knew the tactics, even if they had never employed them in actual combat. "Captain Hayes," Morrison said calmly, "despite the sound of approaching tank engines growing louder, you are not going to withdraw. You are going to destroy every German tank that comes down this road. Your men have trained for this exact situation. Trust your training, trust your men, and trust the tactics. I will be here with you to coordinate the defense." Hayes looked at Morrison with a mixture of doubt and desperation, asking infantry to stand and fight tanks, particularly during a general retreat, went against every survival instinct. But Hayes had also spent months training under Morrison's program, and he had seen in exercises what properly executed tactics could accomplish. He made his decision. "Yes, sir, we will hold this position." Over the next hour, Morrison helped Hayes position his bazooka teams, establish firing positions, designate decoy locations, and brief every soldier on their role in the upcoming engagement. The men moved through the forest with practiced efficiency, taking up positions that would have been suicidal under conventional doctrine, but which Morrison's training had taught them to see as advantageous. They dug shallow depressions to hide their thermal signatures, camouflaged their positions with forest debris, and prepared multiple fallback routes for after they fired their weapons. The first German tanks appeared around 9 in the morning, a column of 5 Panzer IVs advancing in standard road march formation. The tank commanders, expecting only scattered American resistance, rode with their hatches open, scanning the forest on both sides of the road, but seeing nothing to cause alarm. Behind the tanks came trucks filled with German infantry, the soldiers laughing and talking, confident in the overwhelming success of the offensive. Morrison, observing from a concealed position, let the entire column enter the kill zone before giving the signal. In the space of 30 seconds, 4 of the 5 Panzer IVs were hit by bazooka rounds fired from close range 40 to 50 yards from positions the tank crews had driven past without detecting. The lead tank, struck in the engine compartment, burst into flames. The second and third tanks took hits to their sides, penetrating the relatively thin flank armor and destroying the vehicles. The fourth tank at the rear of the column was hit before its crew could even react to the ambush. The fifth tank in the middle of the column managed to rotate its turret and fire a single shot that exploded harmlessly in the trees. Before it could fire again, it was hit by 2 bazooka rounds simultaneously from different directions. The German infantry, caught in the open on their trucks, took heavy casualties from rifle fire before the survivors fled into the forest. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 5 German tanks were burning wrecks blocking the road, and the company had suffered only 3 wounded soldiers. Morrison's tactics had worked exactly as designed, even under the stress of actual combat. But there was no time to celebrate or even to reflect on the significance of what had just happened. Radio reports indicated German armor advancing along multiple roads, and Morrison knew that this single engagement was just the beginning. Over the next 4 hours, Morrison moved from unit to unit along the deteriorating American line, organizing impromptu ambushes and directing anti-tank defenses at critical choke points. At each location, he found soldiers who had been trained in his methods, officers who understood his tactical principles, and situations where the terrain and timing allowed those tactics to be employed. By early afternoon, his ad hoc task force had accounted for the destruction of 17 German tanks, the very 17 that had been bearing down on his position when this narrative began. But 17 tanks, while a significant tactical success, represented only a tiny fraction of the massive German armored force that had been unleashed into the Ardennes. As darkness fell on that first day of the German offensive, Morrison found himself at a hastily organized command post in the town of St. Vith, where senior American commanders were trying to understand the scope of the disaster and organize an effective defense. 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division had been surrounded and cut off. The German penetration was far deeper than anyone had anticipated. The entire Allied position in the Ardennes was threatened. Morrison, exhausted but driven by a fierce determination, approached the temporary division commander. General Warren had been wounded earlier in the day, and made a bold proposal. He requested permission to organize a mobile anti-tank force built around the soldiers who had trained in his methods. Rather than defending static positions where German armor could bypass or overwhelm them, this force would actively hunt German tanks, using their mobility and Morrison's tactics to strike at vulnerable points in the German advance. The acting division commander, a colonel who had been promoted into command just hours earlier, was initially skeptical. American doctrine did not include the concept of infantry actively hunting tanks. That was the job of tank destroyers and friendly armor. But the situation was desperate. Conventional approaches were failing, and Morrison's success earlier in the day had been reported up the chain of command. The colonel made a decision born of desperation and necessity. He authorized Morrison to form his task force. Working through the night, Morrison assembled a composite unit of approximately 500 men drawn from various units of the 106th Division and attached elements from other formations. He prioritized soldiers who had completed his training program and who had already proven themselves in combat that day. He gathered every available bazooka, every anti-tank mine, and every jeep and truck that could be spared. By dawn on December 17th, Task Force Morrison, though it was never officially designated as such, was ready to begin operations. Morrison's plan was unconventional to the point of being radical. Rather than holding defensive positions, he would position his force astride the German lines of communication, targeting supply columns and isolated tank formations. He would use the dense Ardennes forests as cover, moving between positions to strike, and then disappear before German forces could concentrate against him. He would exploit German confidence and their assumption that American infantry could not effectively challenge their armor. Most importantly, he would give his men the opportunity to use their training to turn the tables on an enemy that thought it had already won. The campaign that followed would last 63 days and become one of the most remarkable small unit actions of World War II, though it would remain largely unknown outside military circles for decades afterward. Morrison's task force operated throughout the Battle of the Bulge, engaging German armor under conditions that ranged from desperate to impossible. They fought in blinding snowstorms, in dense fog, in darkness broken only by muzzle flashes and burning vehicles. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in terrain the Germans had seized and thought they controlled. The first major engagement came on December 18th, when Morrison's scouts reported a German supply column moving along a secondary road, protected by a platoon of Panther tanks, some of the most formidable armor Germany fielded. The Panthers, with their thick frontal armor and powerful 75 guns, were widely feared by American tankers. Morrison's men, armed only with bazookas and small arms, were supposed to avoid Panthers and leave them to friendly armor or tank destroyers. Morrison studied the terrain and saw opportunity. The road the Germans were using passed through a narrow defile between two wooded hills. The Panthers, confident in their superiority, were spread out along the column rather than concentrated for mutual support. Morrison positioned his men in the woods on both sides of the road, then sent a small team ahead to create an obstacle, a destroyed American truck positioned to look like it had been abandoned, that would slow the column and bunch the vehicles together. The German column approached the obstacle around noon. The lead Panther stopped to assess whether the road was passable, and the vehicles behind it closed up, exactly as Morrison had anticipated. At ranges between 30 and 60 yards, Morrison's bazooka teams opened fire simultaneously on the vulnerable side and rear armor of the Panthers. 3 of the 4 tanks were destroyed in the initial volley. The 4th Panther attempted to back away but threw a track when its panicked driver steered into a ditch, leaving it immobilized and vulnerable. A follow-up shot destroyed it as well. The supply trucks, lacking the armor protection of the tanks, were easy targets for rifle and machine gun fire. Within 10 minutes, the entire column was destroyed, and Morrison's force had faded back into the forest before German reinforcements could arrive. The engagement demonstrated something Morrison had theorized but never proven in combat, that his tactics worked even against the Germans' heaviest tanks when properly executed. Word of these successes began to spread through the American units fighting in the Bulge. Morrison's task force became something of a legend among the infantrymen who heard of them, a unit that hunted rather than hid from German armor, that struck with devastating effect and disappeared before the enemy could react. Soldiers began volunteering to join the task force, and officers requested that Morrison train their units in his tactics. What had begun as an experimental approach advocated by one maverick officer was becoming recognized as a viable and valuable capability. But Morrison was also learning hard lessons about the limitations of his tactics and the costs of aggressive anti-tank operations. Not every engagement went as planned. On December 20th, one of his teams was caught in the open by a German tank they had not detected in time. All 6 men were killed before they could fire a shot. On December 22nd, an ambush position was compromised when a German infantry patrol stumbled upon it prematurely, resulting in a firefight that alerted nearby tanks and forced Morrison's men to withdraw without accomplishing their mission. The tactics worked, but they were not magic, and they required near-perfect execution under extreme pressure. Morrison also discovered that the psychological aspects of tank warfare he had studied and incorporated into his training were indeed critical. The German tank crews, particularly those in the elite SS Panzer divisions, were supremely confident in their equipment and their training. This confidence made them aggressive, sometimes to the point of recklessness, pushing forward without adequate infantry support or reconnaissance. Morrison learned to recognize and exploit this tendency, setting ambushes at locations where German tank commanders would be most likely to assume American forces had been cleared out. Conversely, he observed that German tankers whose tanks had been destroyed or damaged by American infantry became notably more cautious in subsequent operations. The psychological impact of being attacked by infantry at close range, of having their steel fortress penetrated by foot soldiers with handheld weapons, created a wariness that degraded German tactical effectiveness. Morrison began deliberately orchestrating engagements to maximize this psychological effect, ensuring that German crews who survived his ambushes would spread word of what they had experienced. One engagement in particular illustrated this psychological dimension perfectly. On December 27th, Morrison's scouts reported a company of German tanks, approximately 15 vehicles, bivouacked in a small village they had captured the previous day. The tanks were dispersed throughout the village, and the crews had dismounted to rest and eat, confident that they were well behind German lines and in no danger from American forces. Morrison organized a night raid, something that was almost unheard of in anti-tank operations. Under cover of darkness, his men infiltrated the village, moving silently between buildings to position themselves near each tank. At Morrison's signal delivered by radio at precisely 3 in the morning, they attacked simultaneously. The German crews, awakened by explosions and gunfire, found their tanks on fire before they could even reach them. In the confusion and darkness, German soldiers fired at shadows while Morrison's men systematically destroyed vehicle after vehicle before melting back into the night. The actual material damage from the raid was significant. 11 tanks destroyed, 4 damaged, but the psychological impact was even greater. The German unit that had been attacked was effectively combat ineffective for the next week, not because they lacked equipment, but because the experience of being attacked at night by invisible enemies had shattered their sense of security and tactical confidence. Other German units in the sector began adopting much more cautious defensive procedures, which slowed their offensive operations and made them more vulnerable to American counterattacks. Throughout late December and into January, as the German offensive gradually stalled and American forces began their counteroffensive to reduce the Bulge, they were assigned increasingly important missions supporting the defense of Bastogne by interdicting German reinforcement routes, covering the withdrawal of American forces from exposed positions, and spearheading counterattacks by clearing German armor from key terrain. The tally of destroyed German tanks continued to mount: 23 by Christmas Day, 57 by New Year's Day, 112 by January 15th. The tactics that Morrison had developed in the training grounds of Kentucky and Indiana were proving themselves in the most demanding combat environment imaginable, but success came at a cost. Morrison's task force suffered regular casualties as they engaged in the most dangerous form of combat, close-range fights against armor, where a single mistake or moment of bad luck could be fatal. By mid-January, the task force had suffered 37 killed and 68 wounded, a casualty rate that would have been unsustainable for most units. Yet volunteers continued to seek assignment to the force, drawn by its reputation and effectiveness. Morrison himself was wounded on January 18th when a German tank shell exploded near his command post, sending shrapnel through his left arm and shoulder. He refused evacuation, having the battalion aid station bandage his wounds and returning to duty within hours. His rationale was simple. The campaign was not over, his men needed his leadership, and he was not going to let a relatively minor wound prevent him from completing the mission. It was a decision that would later contribute to permanent nerve damage in his arm, but in the moment, Morrison considered it merely the minimum price of command. The final major engagement of the campaign occurred on February 17, 63 days after the German offensive had begun. Morrison's task force was assigned to support the final American push to restore the original front lines by clearing German forces from a forested area near the German border. Intelligence indicated that a battalion of German armor was conducting a fighting withdrawal through the sector, and standard doctrine would have called for American armor to engage them. But the terrain-dense forest with narrow trails was unsuitable for tank-on-tank combat. Morrison was asked if his force could handle the mission. By this point, Morrison and his men had become specialists in exactly this type of operation. They infiltrated the forest ahead of the main American advance, located the German tanks as they moved along the limited road network, and organized a series of coordinated ambushes. Over the course of 8 hours, they engaged German armor at 7 different locations, destroying 35 tanks and forcing the remainder to abandon their vehicles and withdraw on foot. It was the single most successful day of the entire campaign, and it brought the total of German tanks destroyed by Morrison's task force to 147. With the Bulge eliminated and the front lines stabilized, the 106th Infantry Division was withdrawn from the line in late February 1945 to rest and refit. Morrison's task force was disbanded, its soldiers returning to their parent units, many carrying with them a veteran's understanding of tank warfare that would serve them for the remainder of the war. Morrison himself, now promoted to colonel and bearing a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, was summoned to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Paris. He assumed he was being called to provide briefings on his tactics or perhaps to help develop training programs for other units. What he encountered instead was something he had not anticipated: official discomfort with his methods and their implications. The briefing he received was delivered by a brigadier general from the Operations Division, and its message was clear if diplomatically phrased. Morrison's tactics had been effective, but they were problematic from a doctrinal standpoint. The Army had spent considerable resources developing specialized anti-tank units, tank destroyer battalions equipped with mobile anti-tank guns and armored vehicles specifically designed for engaging enemy tanks. Morrison's success with ordinary infantry armed with bazookas raised uncomfortable questions about whether those specialized units were necessary. Moreover, Morrison's emphasis on close-range engagement and aggressive hunting of tanks was at odds with the Army's emerging doctrine for armor warfare, which emphasized tank-on-tank combat and indirect fire from specialized platforms. If Morrison's methods became widely adopted, it would require rewriting field manuals, changing training programs, and essentially admitting that the Army's approach to anti-tank warfare had been suboptimal. The institutional investment in existing doctrine was enormous, and there was considerable resistance to the idea of fundamentally changing it based on one officer's experience, however successful. Morrison sat in that briefing room in Paris and realized that his tactics, proven in combat over 63 days of the most intense fighting of the war, were being suppressed, not because they did not work, but because they worked too well. The bureaucratic machinery of the Army was already looking ahead to post-war planning, to peacetime doctrine development, to the institutional interests of various branches and specialties. Morrison's revolutionary approach to tank warfare was threatening to disrupt plans that had been years in development. The general concluded the briefing by informing Morrison that he was being assigned to a planning staff position for the remainder of the war, where his experience would be valuable, but where he would not be in a position to continue developing or promoting his tactical methods. His after-action reports would be classified and restricted to senior officers. No formal training program based on his methods would be developed for general distribution. The official position was that Task Force Morrison had been a temporary expedient suitable for the unique conditions of the Bulge, but not something that represented fundamental innovation requiring changes to Army doctrine. Morrison understood that he was being quietly sidelined, his moment of innovation acknowledged but contained. He could have fought the decision, could have appealed to senior commanders who had witnessed his unit's effectiveness, could have gone public with his criticisms of Army doctrine. But he was also a career officer who understood the limits of what was possible within a large bureaucratic institution. He accepted his new assignment without protest, knowing that someday, perhaps, the true story of what his unit had accomplished would be recognized. The official suppression of Morrison's work might have been the end of the story, except for one factor that the Army's planners had not fully considered. The soldiers who had trained under Morrison and fought using his tactics remembered those experiences. They went on to fight in other campaigns through Germany, across the Rhine into the final battles of the European War. They shared what they had learned with soldiers in other units. They wrote letters home describing their experiences. They survived the war and became veterans who told their stories to whoever would listen. Moreover, some officers who had observed Morrison's success or read his classified reports before they were restricted recognized the value of his innovations. They quietly incorporated elements of his tactics into their own training and operations. They passed along his insights about tank vulnerabilities, crew psychology, and close-range engagement techniques. The official doctrine might have ignored Morrison's work, but the unofficial, ground-level culture of the Army absorbed and transmitted it through informal channels. Morrison himself spent the final months of the war in staff positions, contributing to operational planning but never returning to the front lines. He was present in Germany when the war in Europe ended in May 1945, and he participated in the early stages of occupation duty. When the Army began its rapid demobilization in late 1945, Morrison faced a decision: remain in the peacetime Army or return to civilian life. He chose to stay, hoping that perhaps in the post-war environment there would be opportunity to continue developing innovative tactical approaches. The Cold War era that followed brought new challenges and new threats, including the prospect of facing massive Soviet tank formations in any future European conflict. Morrison, now assigned to various staff and training positions, wrote extensively about anti-tank tactics and infantry armor integration. His writings, though never formally published or widely distributed, circulated among military educators and tactical analysts. He continued to advocate for training infantry to aggressively engage armor rather than relying solely on specialized platforms, but the institutional resistance he had encountered in 1945 persisted throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The Army of the early Cold War was heavily influenced by the lessons it chose to remember from World War II. There was little institutional appetite for tactics that relied on the initiative of individual soldiers, or that suggested expensive weapons systems might be less important than proper training and tactics. Morrison's ideas remained interesting but marginalized, something to be studied in advanced courses but not incorporated into basic doctrine. The suppression of Morrison's work lasted 15 years, from 1945 to 1960. During that period, his after-action reports remained classified, his training manuals were restricted to specialized audiences, and his name was largely forgotten outside of narrow military circles. But in 1960 something changed. The Army, preparing for potential conflicts in varied terrain including the jungles of Southeast Asia, commissioned a comprehensive study of infantry anti-tank operations in World War II. The study team, granted access to classified archives, discovered Morrison's reports and recognized their significance. The study's authors were struck by the discrepancy between Morrison's documented results and his complete absence from official Army history and doctrine. They interviewed Morrison, now a colonel teaching at the Command and General Staff College, and reviewed the records of the units that had fought under his direction. Their conclusions were unambiguous. Morrison had developed and proven a revolutionary approach to anti-tank warfare that had been suppressed for institutional rather than tactical reasons. They recommended that his methods be formally studied and incorporated into Army training. The recommendation was controversial, challenging as it did 15 years of established doctrine and implicitly criticizing the Army's earlier decision to suppress Morrison's work. But the military environment of 1960 was different from 1945. The Army was facing the prospect of conflicts in environments where heavy armor might be impractical but where enemy tanks would still be a threat. Places like Southeast Asia where Vietnamese forces might employ Soviet-supplied armor against American infantry. In that context, Morrison's emphasis on infantry capability to engage tanks with minimal support suddenly seemed relevant again. In 1961, the Army declassified Morrison's World War II after-action reports and authorized the development of a formal training program based on his tactics. Morrison, promoted to brigadier general, was assigned to oversee the program's development. He spent the next 3 years creating updated versions of his training methods, incorporating new weapons technology, including improved anti-tank rockets, but maintaining the core principles he had developed 2 decades earlier: understand the enemy's psychology, exploit mechanical vulnerabilities, train to operate at close range, and think of infantry not as passive targets for armor, but as active hunters. The Vietnam War provided a limited test of these updated tactics. While large-scale tank battles were rare in Southeast Asia, there were instances where American infantry encountered North Vietnamese armor, particularly in the later stages of the conflict. Units that had received training based on Morrison's methods consistently performed well in these encounters, destroying enemy tanks through close-range ambushes and coordinated team tactics. The Army's official after-action analysis credited Morrison's training program with significantly reducing American casualties in infantry tank encounters. Morrison retired from active duty in 1968, having finally seen his tactics vindicated and incorporated into official doctrine. He spent his retirement years in Massachusetts, not far from where he had grown up, and devoted himself to writing a comprehensive study of infantry armor warfare that synthesized his World War II experience with subsequent developments. The book, Infantry Against Armor: Tactical Innovation in Modern Warfare, was published in 1972 and became required reading at military academies and staff colleges. Modern military analysts studying Morrison's career and tactics have identified several reasons why his methods remained relevant across decades, despite dramatic changes in tank technology. First, Morrison had focused not on exploiting specific vulnerabilities of specific tank models, but on understanding the fundamental limitations inherent in armored warfare: limited visibility, dependence on supporting infantry, psychological factors affecting crew performance. These limitations persisted even as tanks became more sophisticated. Second, Morrison's emphasis on psychological conditioning and aggressive tactics addressed a fundamental problem in infantry armor combat: the tendency of infantry to become passive or panicked when facing armored threats. This psychological dimension remained critical regardless of technology. A soldier who had been trained to see tanks as vulnerable targets rather than invincible threats would fight more effectively whether facing a World War II Panzer or a modern main battle tank. Third, Morrison's training philosophy emphasized principles over procedures, teaching soldiers to think critically about how to engage armor rather than simply following checklists. This approach created adaptable soldiers who could adjust their tactics to changing circumstances and enemy capabilities. In contrast, training that focused on memorizing specific procedures for engaging specific threats produced soldiers who struggled when confronted with unexpected situations. The evolution of anti-tank weapons from World War II bazookas to modern shoulder-fired missiles made Morrison's close-range engagement tactics even more effective. Modern anti-tank missiles, with their sophisticated guidance systems and enhanced penetrating power, could destroy any tank at ranges where Morrison had taught soldiers to engage. His tactical principles, combined with improved weapons, created a capability that made infantry a legitimate threat to even the most advanced armor. Morrison's influence extended beyond American military practice. His writings were translated and studied by foreign militaries, particularly those facing the prospect of confronting superior armored forces with limited resources. The Israeli Defense Forces, facing numerically superior Arab armor in the wars of 1967 and 1973, incorporated many of Morrison's principles into their infantry training. Vietnamese forces fighting against American armor adapted some of his tactics, using close-range ambushes and psychological warfare to offset American technological advantages. The irony of Morrison's influence on enemy forces was not lost on military historians. The same tactics the U.S. Army had suppressed in 1945, because they challenged institutional interests, were studied and employed by adversaries precisely because they were effective. This created situations where American forces faced enemies using adaptations of Morrison's methods, highlighting the costs of the 15-year suppression of his work. In the post-Cold War era, Morrison's legacy has been reassessed and his contributions more fully recognized. The modern U.S. Army's infantry training includes elements derived directly from Morrison's work, though often without attribution. The emphasis on close-range engagement of armor, the training in tank vulnerabilities, the psychological conditioning to reduce fear of armored threats, all trace their lineage to Morrison's innovations in the 1940s, even if that lineage is not always acknowledged. Military historians now recognize Morrison as part of a tradition of tactical innovators who challenged established doctrine and paid professional costs for doing so. His experience parallels that of other military visionaries who were ahead of their time, officers whose insights were initially rejected by institutional bureaucracies, but eventually vindicated by battlefield results. The suppression of his work is studied as a case study in how large military organizations can stifle innovation when it threatens established interests or challenges existing doctrine. The psychological aspects of Morrison's work have attracted particular attention from modern military researchers. His understanding that tank warfare was as much about psychology as mechanics, that crew confidence could be exploited as a vulnerability, and that proper training could overcome infantry's natural fear of armor. These insights have influenced military psychology training programs beyond just anti-tank operations. The same principles apply to training soldiers to overcome fear in any asymmetric engagement where they face an apparently superior adversary. One of the most detailed studies of Morrison's tactics came in 1994 when the U.S. Army Center of Military History published Innovation Under Fire, The Morrison Doctrine and Infantry Anti-Tank Warfare 1942 to 1945. The study drew on recently declassified documents, interviews with surviving veterans of Morrison's units, and comparative analysis of anti-tank operations throughout the European theater. The study concluded that units trained in Morrison's methods had casualty rates 23% lower than comparable units using standard doctrine when engaging German armor, while achieving kill rates 47% higher. These statistics suggested that suppressing Morrison's work had likely cost hundreds of American lives during World War II, a sobering conclusion that sparked debate about military innovation and institutional resistance to change. The study also documented the extent of the official suppression. Morrison's after-action reports had not merely been classified, they had been actively withheld from researchers preparing the Army's official history of the European campaign. Training manuals he had written were removed from circulation and destroyed. Officers who had served with him were discouraged from discussing his tactics in official contexts. The suppression was systematic and deliberate, driven by senior officers who saw Morrison's success as a threat to their own concepts of how armor warfare should be conducted. In 2004, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College dedicated a chair in Morrison's name, recognizing his contributions to military education and tactical innovation. The Edward Morrison Chair in Tactical Innovation is occupied by a senior officer or civilian professor who focuses on identifying and overcoming institutional barriers to tactical and operational innovation. The chair's mission statement explicitly acknowledges that military organizations have historically struggled to recognize and adopt innovative practices, and commits to fostering an environment where innovation is encouraged rather than suppressed. Morrison himself passed away in 1987 at the age of 75, having lived long enough to see his tactics vindicated and his contributions acknowledged, even if the recognition came decades later than it should have. In his final years, he gave several lengthy interviews to military historians, providing detailed accounts of his training methods, combat experiences, and reflections on institutional resistance to innovation. These interviews have become primary sources for anyone studying tactical innovation and organizational change in military institutions. In one particularly poignant interview conducted in 1985, Morrison was asked whether he regretted the professional costs he had paid for his innovations, the years of bureaucratic opposition, the suppression of his work, the missed promotions and opportunities. His answer was characteristically thoughtful. "I regret that the Army did not adopt these tactics more widely during the war. I believe lives could have been saved, but I do not regret developing them or fighting for them to be recognized." A soldier's duty is not just to follow orders but to think critically about how to accomplish the mission with minimum casualties to his own forces. If I had remained silent about what I had discovered because it was professionally inconvenient, I would have failed that duty. Morrison's story raises profound questions about how military organizations balance the need for standardized doctrine with the imperative to innovate and adapt. Every military institution faces this tension. Doctrine provides coherence and coordination across large formations, but it can also stifle innovation and prevent the adoption of superior methods. Morrison's experience illustrates both the potential for individual officers to make revolutionary contributions and the organizational barriers that can prevent those contributions from being recognized and implemented. The tactical principles Morrison developed remain relevant in contemporary military operations. Modern infantry forces facing armored threats in asymmetric conflicts continue to employ variations of his tactics. The Afghan insurgency's use of close-range anti-tank attacks against coalition armor drew explicitly on Morrison's principles, as documented in captured training materials. The same methods an American colonel had developed to fight German Panzers in 1944 were being used against American forces in Afghanistan 70 years later, a testament to the enduring validity of Morrison's core insights. This continuity across decades and conflicts underscores a fundamental truth. Morrison understood technology changes, but the basic dynamics of infantry armor combat remain constant. Tanks will always have limited visibility, will always depend on supporting infantry, will always be operated by human crews subject to psychological pressures. Infantry armed with proper training and appropriate weapons will always have the potential to exploit those limitations. Morrison's contribution was to recognize these eternal truths and develop a systematic approach to exploiting them. The 12 battles where Morrison's doctrine was tested most severely during the Battle of the Bulge deserve individual examination, as each revealed different aspects of his tactical philosophy and its application under varying conditions. The engagement at Schönberg Crossroads on December 16, already described, was the first and established the pattern: close-range ambush, simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, exploitation of tank crews' limited visibility and confidence. But subsequent engagements revealed additional dimensions of Morrison's thinking. The night raid on the German tank bivouac on December 27 demonstrated Morrison's willingness to violate established norms of when and how infantry could engage armor. Night operations against tanks were virtually unheard of. The limited visibility was thought to create too much risk of fratricide or of infantry teams being overrun by tanks they could not see. Morrison recognized that these same visibility limitations applied to tank crews perhaps even more severely, and that the psychological shock of a night attack would multiply its effectiveness. The raid succeeded beyond expectations, and Morrison incorporated night operations into his standard tactics thereafter. The defense of a bridge near Vielsalm on December 21 revealed Morrison's understanding of terrain exploitation. German armor attempting to cross the bridge found itself channeled into a narrow approach where Morrison's teams had prepared multiple firing positions on elevated ground. The Germans, unable to maneuver off the road due to soft ground on either side, were forced to advance directly into the kill zone. 7 Panther tanks were destroyed in rapid succession, and the bridge was denied to German forces for the remainder of that critical day. Morrison later wrote that proper terrain selection could multiply the effectiveness of infantry anti-tank teams by factors of 3 to 5 compared to engagement on open ground. An engagement on December 30 near Bastogne illustrated Morrison's tactics for dealing with combined arms formations, German tanks supported by infantry, the most challenging scenario for anti-tank operations. Morrison's teams used a phased approach. First, suppress the German infantry with rifle and machine gun fire to separate them from their armor. Second, force the tanks to button up by threatening them with bazooka fire, even if no clear shot was available. Third, exploit the buttoned-up tanks' limited visibility to close to effective range and execute kills. The engagement was successful, destroying 5 tanks and routing the supporting infantry, but it was also costly. Morrison's force suffered 12 casualties, demonstrating that even superior tactics did not guarantee bloodless victories. The engagement at Hoffelise on January 7 was perhaps Morrison's most audacious operation. Intelligence indicated that a German tank battalion was using a village as a staging area, with tanks dispersed throughout the streets. Morrison led a daylight raid directly into the village, his teams moving between buildings in coordinated groups. The Germans, not expecting American infantry to penetrate so deep behind their lines, were caught completely by surprise. 14 tanks were destroyed, and Morrison's force withdrew with minimal casualties. The operation demonstrated his principle that aggressive action could sometimes be safer than cautious defense, because aggression disoriented enemies and denied them time to organize effective responses. On January 12, Morrison's force engaged a convoy of German armor retreating toward German lines. Rather than attacking the convoy directly, Morrison positioned his teams to wait until the convoy had passed, then ambushed the rearmost vehicles. This created confusion among German commanders who could not determine where the attack was coming from, and prevented the forward vehicles from easily returning to support the rear of the column. The engagement destroyed 9 tanks and demonstrated Morrison's understanding of temporal and spatial exploitation, attacking not just where the enemy was vulnerable, but when. The battle at Biho on January 18, the same day Morrison was wounded, involved engaging German armor operating in heavy fog. Visibility was less than 50 yards, creating conditions that Morrison recognized as favorable for close-range infantry attacks. His teams used the fog to approach German tanks undetected, sometimes coming within 20 yards before firing. The Germans, unable to see their attackers even after being hit, were paralyzed by the fog that had initially seemed to provide them cover. 11 tanks were destroyed before the fog lifted. Morrison's wound came from a shell fired by a German tank shooting blindly into the fog, a reminder that even the best tactics did not eliminate risk. The defense of Trois-Ponts on January 25 demonstrated Morrison's integrated approach to defensive operations. Rather than establishing a linear defense, he positioned anti-tank teams in depth, with multiple fallback positions prepared in advance. As German tanks penetrated the first line of defense, they found themselves advancing into successive ambushes, each more difficult to respond to than the last. The Germans eventually withdrew after losing 8 tanks, having concluded that the position was too heavily defended by anti-tank guns, though in reality, Morrison had only bazooka teams whose mobility allowed them to redeploy and engage from multiple positions, creating the illusion of greater strength. An engagement on February 2 near the German border illustrated Morrison's adaptation to changing German tactics. By this point in the battle, German tank crews had become aware of American infantry's enhanced anti-tank capability and were advancing much more cautiously, keeping their infantry closer and buttoning up more readily. Morrison countered by using larger decoy forces to draw German attention while his actual attack teams approached from unexpected directions. The engagement destroyed 6 tanks but required nearly an hour of maneuvering before Morrison's teams could achieve favorable firing positions, evidence that the Germans were learning and adapting to his tactics. The final major engagement on February 17th, which accounted for 35 tank kills, demonstrated the full maturity of Morrison's tactical system. His force had by this point become supremely proficient at every aspect of anti-tank operations: reconnaissance, positioning, coordination, execution, and disengagement. They operated with the confidence and precision of a finely tuned machine, each soldier understanding not just his own role, but how his actions fit into the larger tactical picture. The engagement was a validation of Morrison's belief that properly trained infantry could consistently defeat armor, even armor operated by experienced crews. Across these 12 major engagements and dozens of smaller actions, certain patterns emerged that defined Morrison's approach. First, he emphasized reconnaissance and intelligence. His teams spent as much time observing and tracking German armor as they did fighting it. This intelligence allowed Morrison to choose when and where to engage, ensuring his forces fought on favorable terms whenever possible. Second, Morrison insisted on aggressive tactical initiative. Conventional doctrine treated infantry armor combat as reactive. Infantry defended positions and responded to tank attacks. Morrison reversed this dynamic, having his infantry actively hunt tanks and choose the time and place of engagement. This psychological reversal, turning infantry from prey into predators, had profound effects on both American soldiers' confidence and German crews' caution. Third, Morrison's tactics required exceptional coordination and communication. Successful ambushes involved multiple teams attacking simultaneously from different directions, which required precise timing and often occurred without radio communication to avoid detection. Morrison's training emphasis on rehearsal and standardized procedures allowed his teams to coordinate through visual signals and anticipated actions. Fourth, Morrison recognized that casualties were inevitable and planned accordingly. He trained his soldiers in casualty evacuation procedures integrated into anti-tank operations. Wounded soldiers would be extracted by designated team members while others continued the engagement. This planning reduced panic when casualties occurred and contributed to force cohesion under fire. Fifth, Morrison emphasized learning and adaptation. After every engagement, he conducted detailed debriefs to identify what had worked, what had not, and what could be improved. This systematic approach to learning allowed his force to continuously refine their tactics based on combat experience, becoming more effective as the campaign progressed. The psychological warfare dimension of Morrison's operations deserves particular attention, as it represents one of his most innovative contributions. Morrison understood that tank warfare was not purely a mechanical contest of armor thickness versus penetration capability. It was also a psychological contest between the confidence of tank crews and the determination of infantry. German tank crews in 1944 operated with a psychological advantage cultivated by years of successful operations. They believed their tanks made them virtually invincible against infantry, and this belief informed their tactical decisions. Morrison's tactics systematically undermined that psychological advantage by attacking at very close ranges from unexpected directions. His teams created situations where German crews realized they were vulnerable in circumstances where they had expected to be safe. A tank commander who had watched an American infantry team destroy his platoon mate's tank from just 50 yards away could never again feel completely secure in his armor. The psychological effect of this realization spread through German units as surviving crews shared their experiences. Morrison also deliberately exploited German tank crews' isolation inside their vehicles. Buttoned up for combat, crews experienced significant sensory deprivation. Their view of the battlefield was limited to narrow periscopes. Their hearing was dominated by their own engine noise, and they were cut off from direct communication with supporting infantry. Morrison's tactics took advantage of this isolation by creating confusion about where attacks were coming from and how many attackers were present. A crew that took fire from one direction would button up and attempt to locate the threat, becoming blind to teams approaching from other directions. The testimony of German prisoners captured after engagements with Morrison's force revealed the psychological impact of his tactics. One German tank commander described the experience: "We entered the American sector believing our tanks were invincible and that American infantry would flee at our approach. Instead, we found ourselves hunted by invisible enemies who struck from close range and disappeared. Every tree, every building, every depression in the ground became a potential threat." The psychological strain of knowing you could be attacked at any moment from any direction was worse than the actual combat. This psychological dimension was perhaps Morrison's most enduring contribution because it operated independently of specific weapons or tank models. Whether facing a Panzer IV or a modern main battle tank, infantry trained to see armor as vulnerable and to attack aggressively would have psychological advantages over tank crews expecting infantry to be passive or defensive. Morrison had identified a fundamental truth about the psychology of armored warfare that remained valid across technological generations. The suppression of Morrison's work from 1945 to 1960 had consequences that extended beyond missed opportunities for doctrine development. Some of those consequences were tactical and operational. American forces fighting in Korea faced enemy armor with training that was inferior to what Morrison had proven effective in World War II. The Korean War saw numerous instances of American infantry being routed by North Korean and Chinese tanks, despite those tanks being inferior to the German armor Morrison's men had defeated. Better training might have prevented some of these tactical setbacks. Other consequences were institutional and cultural. The suppression of Morrison's work sent a message throughout the army that tactical innovation, particularly innovation that challenged established doctrine or threatened institutional interests, was professionally risky. Officers who might have developed their own innovations in other areas of warfare observed what happened to Morrison and drew the lesson that it was safer to conform to accepted doctrine than to challenge it, regardless of battlefield results. The cost of this cultural message cannot be precisely calculated, but it likely resulted in the loss of numerous potential innovations that were never developed or proposed because creative officers learned to keep their unconventional ideas to themselves. The suppression also had educational consequences. Military academies and staff colleges taught tank warfare without reference to Morrison's methods or results. An entire generation of officers was educated in doctrine that Morrison had proven suboptimal. When some of these officers encountered situations where Morrison's tactics would have been applicable, they lacked the training and conceptual framework to develop appropriate responses. The institutional knowledge that Morrison had created was lost, requiring it to be rediscovered or reinvented in later conflicts. Perhaps most significantly, the suppression represented a failure of institutional learning. Military organizations exist in part to learn from experience, to study what works and what does not, and to disseminate effective practices throughout the force. By suppressing Morrison's work, the Army failed this fundamental function. It chose institutional convenience over combat effectiveness, preserving existing doctrine at the cost of adopting proven innovations. This failure illustrated a pathology that affects many large organizations, the tendency to protect established practices and power structures even when evidence suggests they should be changed. The eventual vindication and adoption of Morrison's tactics in the 1960s demonstrated that good ideas can eventually overcome institutional resistance, but at a cost measured in time and opportunity. The 15-year delay in adopting Morrison's methods meant that the Army fought the Korean War without fully incorporating lessons that had been learned in World War II. It meant that a generation of soldiers received suboptimal training. It meant that tactical problems Morrison had solved remained unsolved in official doctrine for a decade and a half. Modern military analysts studying Morrison's case have identified several factors that contributed to the suppression and subsequent vindication of his work. The initial suppression in 1945 was driven by institutional interests, the existence of specialized anti-tank units, whose justification was threatened by Morrison's success with ordinary infantry, and the institutional investment in doctrine that Morrison's methods contradicted. Senior officers who had built careers around existing approaches to tank warfare had professional incentives to dismiss or marginalize Morrison's innovations. The vindication in 1960 was enabled by several factors: generational change in military leadership, as officers who had been junior during World War II and had witnessed Morrison's results rose to senior positions; the changing strategic environment, which created demand for tactics suitable for unconventional conflicts, and the personal advocacy of officers who had studied Morrison's work and recognized its value. The declassification and adoption of his tactics required all these factors to align, illustrating how difficult it can be to change military doctrine even when the evidence for change is compelling. The influence of Morrison's work on Cold War anti-tank doctrine deserves examination, as it represents the practical impact of his eventually vindicated innovations. During the Cold War, NATO forces faced the prospect of confronting massive Soviet tank formations in any European conflict. Soviet doctrine emphasized the use of armor in massed formations to achieve breakthrough and deep penetration of enemy lines. NATO, which could not match Soviet tank numbers, needed effective methods for infantry to engage armor without requiring specialized anti-tank platforms for every encounter. Morrison's tactics provided a conceptual framework for this problem. If ordinary infantry could be trained to effectively engage tanks at close range using man-portable weapons, then every infantry unit became an anti-tank capability. This multiplied the defensive capability of NATO forces significantly, rather than relying on limited numbers of specialized anti-tank units to counter Soviet armor. NATO could create defense in depth where Soviet tanks would face anti-tank threats from multiple directions and at multiple points as they advanced. The development of improved anti-tank weapons during the Cold War made Morrison's tactics even more viable. Weapons like the M72LA and later the AT-4 and Javelin gave infantry far more effective anti-tank capability than the World War II Bazooka. But the weapons alone were not sufficient. Soldiers needed training in how to employ them effectively, and that training drew heavily on Morrison's principles of close-range engagement, exploitation of tank vulnerabilities, and psychological conditioning to overcome fear of armor. NATO exercises during the Cold War regularly incorporated infantry anti-tank operations based on Morrison's tactics. These exercises demonstrated that properly trained infantry operating in favorable terrain could inflict substantial casualties on attacking armor even when significantly outnumbered. The deterrent value of this capability was significant. Soviet planners could not assume that their numerical superiority in tanks would translate directly into battlefield success, because they would face infantry capable of contesting their advance at every point. The psychological dimension of Morrison's work also influenced Cold War doctrine. NATO training emphasized that Soviet tank crews, while well-trained and equipped, were not invincible. Infantry were taught to recognize that Soviet armor had the same fundamental vulnerabilities as any tank: limited visibility, dependence on supporting infantry, susceptibility to attacks from unexpected directions. This training reduced the psychological advantage Soviet forces might have gained from their numerical superiority and more modern equipment. In the post-Cold War era, Morrison's legacy has continued to influence military practice in unexpected ways. The proliferation of man-portable anti-tank weapons globally has made infantry anti-tank capability almost universal. Insurgent forces in various conflicts have employed tactics that echo Morrison's principles: close-range ambushes, attacks from multiple directions, exploitation of vehicle crews' limited visibility. The global diffusion of these tactics, whether through deliberate study of Morrison's work or through independent discovery of similar principles, has fundamentally changed the dynamics of asymmetric warfare. Modern American forces have faced the ironic situation of being on the receiving end of tactics derived from or similar to Morrison's innovations. In Iraq and Afghanistan, insurgent forces employed close-range anti-tank tactics against American armored vehicles with considerable success. The U.S. military's response has included development of improved vehicle armor, active protection systems, and enhanced situational awareness capabilities for vehicle crews, all measures designed to counter the types of tactics Morrison pioneered 70 years earlier. The evolution of armor and anti-armor capabilities continues to be influenced by the fundamental insights Morrison had about the infantry-armor relationship. The educational dimension of Morrison's legacy is reflected in how his work is taught at military institutions today. His case is studied not just for his specific tactical innovations, but as an example of how to think critically about military problems. Students learn to question established doctrine, to analyze problems from first principles, to consider psychological as well as material factors, and to recognize that effective solutions often come from unconventional thinking. Morrison's intellectual approach, his integration of engineering, psychology, and tactical analysis, provides a model for how military officers can develop innovative solutions to complex problems. Morrison's emphasis on training and psychological conditioning has also had lasting influence on military education. The recognition that soldiers can be systematically trained to overcome natural fear responses, to operate effectively under extreme pressure, and to execute complex tactics in chaotic environments, shapes modern training programs across all military specialties, not just anti-tank operations. Morrison's insight that psychological preparation was as important as technical training has become fundamental to how modern militaries prepare soldiers for combat. The specific training methods Morrison developed have been adapted and updated but remain recognizable in modern practice. The use of realistic scenarios, the emphasis on repetition until actions become automatic, the systematic exposure to stressful conditions to build psychological resilience. All these elements of Morrison's training program are standard in contemporary military training. His innovation was not in inventing these techniques, some of which had precedence in earlier military practice, but in systematically applying them to a specific tactical problem and proving their effectiveness through combat results. As we reflect on Edward Morrison's life and career, several themes emerge that extend beyond the specific tactical innovations he developed. First is the importance of intellectual curiosity and interdisciplinary thinking. Morrison's success came in part from his willingness to apply insights from engineering, psychology, and other fields to military problems. He did not limit himself to conventional military analysis, but drew on whatever intellectual resources seemed relevant to understanding tank warfare. This intellectual breadth allowed him to see connections and possibilities that more narrowly focused officers missed. Second is the courage required to challenge established doctrine and institutional interests. Morrison knew from early in his career that his ideas contradicted accepted wisdom and would face resistance from senior officers invested in existing approaches. He pursued his innovations anyway, accepting the professional risks because he believed his methods would save soldiers' lives. This moral courage, the willingness to do what one believes is right, despite institutional pressure to conform, is perhaps his most admirable quality. Third is the importance of systematic testing and refinement. Morrison did not simply propose theories, he methodically tested them, refined them based on results, and proved them in combat. His approach was empirical and evidence-based, allowing him to demonstrate that his methods worked rather than simply arguing they should work. This commitment to testing and refinement distinguished his innovations from mere speculation and ultimately enabled their vindication, despite institutional resistance. Fourth is the reality that even proven innovations can be suppressed for institutional reasons. Morrison's case illustrates that being right is not always sufficient to change military practice. Institutions have their own dynamics and interests, and innovations that threaten those interests may be resisted regardless of their merits. This reality suggests the need for mechanisms within military organizations to protect and promote innovation even when it challenges established practices. Fifth is the long-term power of good ideas. Despite 15 years of suppression, Morrison's tactics were eventually vindicated and adopted. The fundamental soundness of his approach to infantry tank warfare meant that it could not be permanently ignored. This suggests that while institutional resistance can delay the adoption of innovations, it cannot indefinitely suppress truly valuable ideas. The eventual triumph of Morrison's methods demonstrates that military organizations, however slowly, can learn and adapt. The story of Edward Morrison and his revolutionary approach to tank warfare resonates beyond its specific historical context. It speaks to universal themes about innovation, institutional resistance, intellectual courage, and the relationship between individual insight and organizational change. Morrison's experience illustrates both the potential for creative individuals to make profound contributions to military effectiveness and the challenges they face in getting those contributions recognized and implemented. For students of military history, Morrison's story provides insights into how tactical innovations emerge and diffuse through military organizations. It demonstrates that major innovations do not always come from senior officers or institutional research programs, but sometimes emerge from mid-level officers applying creative thinking to practical problems. It shows that combat effectiveness can be significantly enhanced, not just through better equipment but through better training and doctrine. And it illustrates the complex relationship between individual initiative and institutional structure in determining military effectiveness. For military practitioners, Morrison's legacy offers both inspiration and caution. The inspiration comes from his demonstration that creative thinking and systematic problem-solving can produce revolutionary improvements in military capability. The caution comes from recognition that such innovations may face resistance, and that proving their worth requires not just intellectual brilliance, but also persistence, political skill, and sometimes a willingness to accept professional sacrifice for the greater good. For anyone interested in organizational innovation more broadly, Morrison's case provides a detailed example of how new ideas emerge, face resistance, and eventually achieve acceptance in large bureaucratic institutions. The dynamics he encountered, the institutional investment in existing practices, the threat innovations pose to established interests, the difficulty of changing standardized procedures are common to many organizations beyond the military. His eventual success demonstrates that change is possible even in highly conservative institutions, though it may require decades and the alignment of multiple favorable factors. In the final analysis, Edward Morrison's contribution to military science rests on two foundations: the specific tactical innovations he developed, which proved their worth in combat and continue to influence military practice, and the broader demonstration of how creative thinking and systematic analysis can solve problems that conventional approaches have failed to address. His tactics destroyed 147 German tanks in 63 days, but his intellectual example has influenced military thinking for nearly 8 decades. The Bazooka revolution Morrison sparked was ultimately a revolution not just in tactics but in mindset, a transformation from viewing infantry as helpless victims of armored assault to seeing them as capable tank hunters who could turn the tables on armored forces through training, courage, and tactical intelligence. That transformation, more than any specific technique or procedure, represents Morrison's enduring legacy to military practice. Today, nearly 80 years after Morrison crouched in that frozen Belgian foxhole watching 23 Panzers approach, his fundamental insights remain valid. Tank crews still have limited visibility. Infantry still can exploit psychological and tactical vulnerabilities in armored forces. Training and doctrine still matter as much as equipment in determining combat outcomes. The technology has evolved dramatically, but the human and psychological dimensions of warfare that Morrison understood so well remain constant. In recognizing Morrison's contributions, we acknowledge not just one officer's tactical genius, but the broader importance of encouraging, protecting, and rewarding innovation in military organizations. We honor not just what he accomplished but what he represents, the potential for thoughtful, dedicated officers to make contributions that reshape how their services think about and conduct warfare. And we commit ourselves to ensuring that future innovators face fewer obstacles and shorter delays in having their contributions recognized than Morrison encountered. The tank destroyer of our story was not ultimately a weapon or a vehicle, but a man, an MIT-educated engineer who saw warfare as a problem to be solved through analysis, training, and innovation. Edward Morrison's crazy idea, rejected by the Pentagon brass and suppressed for 15 years, proved to be one of the most significant tactical innovations of World War II. His story reminds us that the most important military capabilities are often not weapons or technologies but ideas, and that the officers who develop those ideas deserve recognition and support rather than bureaucratic resistance. As the fires of those destroyed panzers faded into history, Morrison's legacy continued to burn brightly through decades of military practice, education, and innovation. The battles he fought were not just against German armor in the forests of Belgium, but against institutional inertia and doctrinal rigidity. His victories in both arenas, though separated by decades, were equally significant. In honoring his memory, we recommit ourselves to the values he embodied: intellectual curiosity, tactical innovation, moral courage, and above all, dedication to the welfare of the soldiers, whose lives depend on the quality of the training and doctrine we provide them. The snow has long since melted from those Belgian fields where Morrison and his men proved that infantry could defeat armor through skill and courage. The tanks have been scrapped, the foxholes filled in, the soldiers who fought there mostly gone. But the lessons Morrison taught, written in steel and fire across those frozen winter landscapes, endure. They endure in the training programs that prepare today's soldiers, in the tactical manuals that guide infantry armor operations, in the institutional memory of military organizations worldwide. They endure as testimony to the power of one officer's revolutionary thinking to change not just battles, but the fundamental conception of how battles should be fought. Edward Morrison's story is complete, but the revolution he sparked continues. Every time infantry engage armor successfully, every time soldiers overcome fear through proper training, every time tactical innovation challenges and improves established doctrine, Morrison's legacy lives on. His 75 years have passed, but his ideas remain as vital and relevant as they were in that frozen December dawn when he proved that the supposedly impossible was simply a matter of thinking differently and training properly. This is the story of how one engineer's crazy idea destroyed 147 Panzer tanks in 63 days, and in doing so revolutionized infantry armor warfare for generations to come. It is a story of innovation triumphing over institutional resistance, of empirical evidence overcoming doctrinal prejudice, of individual brilliance contributing to organizational effectiveness. It is, above all, a story that deserves to be remembered and studied by anyone who seeks to understand how military organizations learn, adapt, and evolve in response to the challenges of warfare. The tank destroyer was not a vehicle. It was a revolution in thinking forged in the training grounds of America and proven in the frozen forests of Belgium. It was Edward Morrison's legacy to military science and his gift to the soldiers whose lives his innovations saved. And it remains 8 decades later, a testament to the enduring importance of creative thinking, rigorous testing, and unwavering commitment to excellence in military practice.